In 1875, an African army didn't just defeat a foreign force, it destroyed it. European-trained officers, modern rifles, military confidence backed by empire. And yet, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, at a place called Gundet, that entire army was wiped out. Not weakened, not pushed back, annihilated. And if you went to school anywhere outside Ethiopia, chances are you were never told this happened. Why? Because Gundet did something colonial history could not survive. It proved that Africans were not learning war from Europe. Europe was learning how wrong it had been about Africa. At Gundet, Ethiopian commanders didn't fight blindly. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They used intelligence. They used terrain. They used deception. They executed a trap so perfect that even European military observers were forced to admit quietly that this was not luck. And that was the problem. Because if Gundet entered global history honestly, then the entire story of Africa as a passive, militarily inferior continent collapsed. So instead, Gundet was buried, not denied, not disproved, just removed. No chapters, no case studies, no serious analysis. European failures were discussed. African brilliance was erased. Italian, British, and later colonial historians would treat Gundet as an embarrassment, a footnote, an accident of geography. But Ethiopian chronicles tell a different story. Royal records preserved in Ge'ez, church manuscripts, and oral military traditions remembered by the highlands speak clearly. This was a planned, intentional, strategic victory under Emperor Yohannes IV, executed by commanders like Ras Alula, men who understood war long before Europe claimed a monopoly on it. And that is why Gundet had to disappear. Because it didn't just defeat an army, it defeated a myth. Tonight, we are not just telling the story of a battle. We are exposing how history deletes African victories, how silence becomes a weapon, and how one erased valley in Ethiopia terrified empires so much. They made sure you would never hear its name. This is Gundet, and this is why they never wanted you to know it existed. By the early 1870s, Europe believed Africa had no walls left. Egypt, armed, European-trained, and hungry for expansion, was sent south under the authority of Khedive Ismail. Officially, it was administration. In reality, it was conquest. The Egyptian expedition marching toward Ethiopia was not symbolic. It was not ceremonial. It was designed to break a state. Modern rifles, artillery, European officers, foreign military advisors, Swiss, Danish, and French mercenaries embedded directly into command positions. European newspapers already framed Ethiopia as outdated, a highland kingdom living on borrowed time. And in their minds, Gundet would be proof. What Egypt brought was not just an army. It brought a message that African resistance would fold when faced with modern firepower. That African kings ruled only until empire arrived. But what Egypt did not understand, what European observers did not bother to investigate, was that Ethiopia was not waiting to be taught war. It had already mastered it. While the expedition marched with confidence, Ethiopia was silent. And silence in war is never ignorance. Ethiopian chronicles, later preserved and cited by historians such as Gabra Selassie, Herui Wolde Selassie, and imperial-era scribes, make one thing clear. The army of Emperor Yohannes IV was not surprised. Scouts had already mapped the movement of Egyptian columns. Messengers carried intelligence across the highlands. Commanders studied not only the enemy, but the land itself. Ras Alula Engida, the general history would later try to shrink into a footnote, was already positioning forces long before Egypt realized it had been seen. This was not panic preparation. This was deliberate anticipation. The Ethiopian army did not rush to meet the enemy. It waited. Because Ethiopia understood something empire often forgets. Modern weapons mean nothing if the ground beneath your boots belongs to someone else. Gundet was not chosen by chance. And Ethiopian records are explicit about this. The terrain was narrow, broken, a highland corridor where movement compressed and visibility collapsed. Egyptian forces advanced in extended columns long, confident, exposed. What they believed was open passage was, in fact, a funnel. Ethiopian forces took the high ground. Not dramatically, not visibly. They disappeared into the land. Later, Ethiopian chronicles would describe Gundet not as a battlefield, but as a closing space. A place where an army enters believing it is moving forward, only to discover it has nowhere to stand. This was not an ambush born of chance. It was a calculated enclosure. The moment the trap sealed, there was no heroic exchange. There was collapse. Ethiopian forces struck from elevation, not in waves of chaos, but in controlled pressure. Fire did not rain randomly, it answered movement. Egyptian artillery became useless. There was no room to deploy it, no stable ground to anchor command. European officers were cut down early. Chain of command shattered within minutes. Ethiopian sources do not romanticize this moment. They describe confusion, disorientation, men firing blindly into smoke and stone. One chronicle records it simply: the land rose against them. This was not medieval warfare. This was terrain weaponized by intelligence. And in that moment, Egypt's modern army stopped being an army at all. By midday, Gundet was finished. Not contested, not unresolved. Finished. Egyptian casualties were catastrophic. Thousands killed in hours. Units erased so completely that later reports struggled to account for them. Ethiopian losses were minimal by comparison. A detail European histories prefer to blur. Survivors fled in fragments, abandoning weapons, standards, and wounded. No negotiation followed. No retreat was organized. Because there was nothing left to organize. Ethiopian records do not call this a victory. They call it annihilation. And that word is exactly why Gundet disappears from global memory. Here is where the silence becomes intentional. Gundet was not forgotten because it was small. It was erased because it was too clear. European historians reframed it as miscalculation, as logistical failure, as terrain accident. Anything except admitting that an African state had outplanned, outmaneuvered, and destroyed a modern imperial army. Ethiopian sources, royal chronicles, church records, oral military accounts were dismissed as unreliable because they contradicted supremacy. But those same sources predicted what would happen next. Because Gundet was not an exception. It was a warning Europe ignored until Adwa forced them to listen 9 years later. By then, the narrative had already been built. That Adwa was a miracle. That Ethiopia was lucky. That African victory required explanation. But Gundet tells the truth they tried to bury. Africa did not wait to be taught war. Ethiopia did not become modern under pressure. It already was. And long before Adwa shook Europe, the ground at Gundet had already swallowed empire whole. Subscribe to my channel. Share this video. Let the world know more reveals are coming.